Running a business means learning to let go. Every owner reaches a point where they can't be everywhere at once and they have to trust someone. Felix Patterson reached that point at 71 years old, in a country he'd grown to love, with a woman who had all the right answers. She had the title, she had the keys, she had access to every account. And for 2 years, while Felix traveled and relaxed and finally believed he had built something lasting, Cecilia Montoya quietly emptied it, $445,000, gone through fake invoices, inflated costs, and a trust that was never earned, only borrowed. This is what happened when a good man confused loyalty with oversight. The day I handed Cecilia the company seal and the signatory card for the business account, she said, "You won't regret this, Mr. Felix." I remember exactly how she said it, straight in the eye, steady voice, not desperate to please, not overeager, just calm and certain. The kind of certainty that feels like competence when you're standing in front of it and feels like something else entirely in hindsight. I told her I knew I wouldn't, and I shook her hand and I meant it. That was 26 months before I found out what was actually happening inside the company I had worked 2 years to build. 2 years of planning, of registering, of figuring out the labyrinthine requirements of running a legitimate small business as a foreign national in the Philippines, and then 2 more years of watching it get hollowed out from the inside by the person I had trusted to protect it. $445,000. I'm going to say that number plainly right now, and then I'm going to tell you exactly how it disappeared, because the how matters more than the number. The number is just the weight of it. The how is the story. Let me back up to Seattle and to the version of me that existed before any of this happened, because that version is important context for understanding how I got here. I spent 34 years in distribution logistics. Started with a small freight brokerage out of a basement office on Capitol Hill, built it into a mid-sized operation with 14 employees and a client list I was proud of, and sold it at 68 to a regional logistics group that wanted the client relationships and the infrastructure I'd spent 3 decades constructing. The sale didn't make me wealthy in any extravagant sense, but it set me up comfortably enough to retire without anxiety, enough to do something different if something different appealed to me. My ex-wife Sandra and I had divorced 9 years before the sale. It was one of those divorces that happens slowly enough that neither person is surprised by the ending, just tired by the time they get there. No bitterness, no drama. 2 adult children, my son Marcus in Sacramento and my daughter Pam in Vancouver, who had their own households and their own lives and who called reliably on weekends and holidays. I had been alone, functionally, for the better part of a decade by the time I sold the business. Not miserable about it, just alone. The Philippines entered my picture through the most ordinary possible channel, which was a retired couple named Bob and Diane Forsyth who lived 2 streets over from my condo in Eastlake and who had been splitting their time between Seattle and Cebu for 4 years. Bob was my age, had sold a construction supply business a few years before me, and had found the split living arrangement so agreeable that he was actively evangelizing it to anyone who would listen. He told me about the cost differential, the climate, the quality of life in a city where your retirement income stretched 3 times as far. He didn't romanticize it. Bob was an ex-businessman, and he pitched things the way businessmen pitch things, with numbers, with risk factors, with a realistic accounting of the challenges alongside the benefits. He told me about the bureaucratic friction, the infrastructure inconsistencies, the adjustment period, and then he told me that despite all of it, he wouldn't trade the arrangement for anything. I flew to Manila in the spring of my first year of retirement, not planning to do anything in particular, just wanting to form my own opinion. Spent 3 weeks seeing Bob and Diane in Cebu, spent another 2 weeks exploring Manila on my own, and came home with something I hadn't expected, which was an idea. The idea was small at first, more of an observation than a plan. I had noticed, during my time in Manila and in Cebu, a gap in the market for quality, imported American and European consumer goods, particular categories that were undersupplied relative to the obvious demand from the growing middle class and from the expat community. I'd spent 34 years identifying supply chain opportunities, and this one had a shape I recognized. The margins would be tighter than I was used to thinking about in American logistics, but the setup costs were low enough, and the regulatory framework for a foreigner-involved retail import operation was manageable enough. I had done my reading that the risk felt proportionate to the potential return. I went back to the Philippines 6 months later with a more specific agenda, found a suitable commercial space in a mixed-use development in Mandaluyong, engaged a local attorney to handle the registration requirements this time. I checked his IBP registration before signing anything, partly because a fellow named Percival I'd met briefly at an expat forum had given me pointed advice about exactly that kind of verification. Registered a company with a Filipino business partner as required under Philippine law, a straight deal arrangement with a respected local businessman named Ernesto Cabral, who owned several other small commercial enterprises and who had been recommended by my attorney as reliable and hands-off. Ernesto and I were equal shareholders on paper. In practice, he had no operational role and no interest in acquiring one. He was a vehicle for legal compliance, nothing more, and we both understood the arrangement clearly. By month 8, I had a functional small import retail business. 3 employees initially, 2 sales staff, and 1 all-purpose operations assistant. I was living in a serviced apartment in BGC, managing everything directly, learning the supplier relationships, the customs processes, the rhythm of the local retail calendar. It was more work than I had anticipated, and I enjoyed it more than I'd expected to. I was good at business. I had forgotten how much I liked doing it until I was doing it again. The staffing situation changed in month 10 when I decided I needed an office manager. Not a junior one, someone experienced, someone who could handle supplier invoicing, employee scheduling, account reconciliation, and the general administrative architecture of a growing small operation. Someone I could hand the operational controls to with confidence so that I could spend my time on supplier development and strategic direction rather than daily administration. I advertised through a local HR recruitment firm, got 12 applications, screened 7, interviewed 4. Cecilia Montoya was the 3rd interview. She was 43 years old, 8 years of office management experience across 2 previous companies, a logistics firm, which I found relevant, and a small manufacturing company. She had a business administration degree from a respected Philippine university. She was organized in the way that people who are genuinely organized are organized, as opposed to people who have learned to look organized for interviews. Her questions were systematic. Her follow-up points tracked logically. Her questions about the role were pointed at the things that actually mattered operationally. She asked about the accounting software I was using, about supplier payment schedules, about authorization thresholds for discretionary spending. Not the questions of someone trying to make a good impression. The questions of someone doing a preliminary audit. I offered her the position the day after the interview. She negotiated her starting salary by 15%, which I respected, and started the following Monday. For the first 5 months, Cecilia was everything I had hoped for when I hired her. She learned the systems faster than I'd expected. She cleaned up a supplier invoicing backlog that had been bothering me for weeks within her first month. She implemented a filing structure for customs documentation that made the quarterly compliance review a fraction of the time it had previously required. She managed the 2 sales staff with a blend of directness and warmth that kept them productive without making the workplace tense. She handled supplier calls when I was unavailable with a confidence that suppliers seemed to respond to. She was, by every visible measure, exactly what the business needed. My relationship with Cecilia in those first months was professional and cordial. She was not the kind of person who sought personal closeness with the boss. She maintained a clear working distance that I found appropriate. But she was also not cold. She remembered that I took my coffee black and made sure there was always fresh coffee available when I arrived. She flagged problems before they became crises, which is a skill rarer than it sounds. She occasionally asked, with what seemed like genuine interest, how my weekend had been, where I'd been, what I'd eaten, small things, the texture of a functional working relationship. I want to be precise about this because it matters. Cecilia and I were never anything other than employer and employee. The story I'm telling is not a romantic story. It's something in some ways more embarrassing than that. It's a story about a man who trusted an employee completely, without verification, because she was good at her job, and because being good at your job and being trustworthy felt like the same thing when I was watching her work every day. They are not the same thing. That's the lesson. And it cost me $445,000 to learn it. Around the 7-month mark, I began traveling more. My plan had always been to use the Philippines as a base, rather than an anchor to spend portions of each year in Seattle seeing Marcus and Pam, to do some of the travel I'd been deferring for decades. Japan was on the list. Portugal, a long overdue trip to New Zealand where I had a college friend who had been asking me to visit for 15 years. With Cecilia handling operations, the business had a steady center. I could travel for 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a time, checking in by email and occasional video calls, and come back to find everything running in good order. At least that was what it looked like. That last sentence is the important one. At least that was what it looked like. The first extended trip was 6 weeks in Japan and South Korea. I checked in with Cecilia twice a week. She sent me clean summaries, sales figures, supplier payments made, any staff issues addressed. The summaries were formatted consistently and the numbers tracked with what I expected based on the previous month's performance. When I came back, the stockroom was organized. The supplier relationships were intact. The accounts payable and receivable were current. I walked through everything in my first 2 days back and found nothing that concerned me. I went to Seattle for a month to see the kids, then Portugal for 3 weeks, then back to Manila for a concentrated 2-month stretch of supplier development work. The pattern was establishing itself and it felt good, a business that ran whether I was there or not, managed by someone competent, giving me the freedom that I'd originally come to the Philippines to find. What I did not do during any of this time was conduct any systematic review of the financial records at a level of granularity that would have revealed what Cecilia was doing. I reviewed the summaries she sent. I looked at the month-end account balances. I checked that the tax filings were current. I did not pull the individual transaction records. I did not check the invoices against the supplier agreements. I did not compare the payroll disbursements against the employment contracts. I did not look at what was being paid and to whom, with the specific, suspicious attention of a man trying to find something wrong. I was a man who had decided to trust, and trusting meant not looking for what you decided wasn't there. Cecilia, I learned much later, had begun the extractions in the 2nd month after I started traveling regularly. The timing was not coincidental. She had been patient. She had spent 7 months demonstrating competence and reliability, building a record of performance that made me confident enough to leave. And then, the moment I established the travel pattern and the check-in rhythm that made granular oversight impractical, she started. She was systematic in ways that I have to describe with a reluctant admiration, because they were genuinely intelligent and they worked for a long time. The first method was inflated supplier invoices. She had established good relationships with several of our regular suppliers, which I had noticed and appreciated. What I had not noticed was that some of those relationships had become bilateral. In a different sense, she was accepting inflated invoices from certain suppliers, paying them at the inflated rate from the business account, and receiving a portion of the excess as cash from the supplier. The invoices looked legitimate. The suppliers were real. The amounts were elevated by 10 to 20% above the agreed rates, but I never compared the invoices against the original supplier agreements because I trusted Cecilia to manage those relationships. The second method was fake invoices, not for fictional companies, for real companies that we did not actually do business with. She had sourced the names of legitimate Philippine businesses from public registries and created invoices on their behalf for services described in sufficiently vague terms: consulting, logistics support, equipment maintenance, that they could pass a casual review without triggering obvious skepticism. The amounts were individually modest, $2,000 here, $3,000 there, but they accumulated steadily over 2 years. The third method was the most direct and in some ways the most audacious. She had signatory authority on the business account up to a threshold I had set originally, $5,000 per transaction. which I had raised to 10,000 after 8 months because the business was growing and the threshold was creating approval delays that slowed supplier payments. She used that authority for unauthorized cash withdrawals, coded in the account records as petty cash disbursements, at a frequency and volume that the account activity buried if you were looking at monthly totals rather than individual line items. I found out none of this while it was happening. I found out all of it over 4 days in January of my 3rd year, when my accountant in Seattle, a methodical woman named Ruth Okafor, who had been handling my U.S. tax affairs since before I sold the freight business, called me in Manila and said she had questions about the Philippine business financials that I had sent for her review. Ruth had been looking at the figures I'd given her for the purpose of U.S. tax reporting on my foreign business income. She wasn't doing an audit, she was doing routine preparation. But Ruth has been doing accounts for 30 years, and she has a particular instinct for numbers that don't sit right. And she said that the expense ratios across several categories had been moving in a direction that was inconsistent with the revenue pattern, and that she wanted to understand why before she filed anything that she'd have to answer for later. I told her I'd look into it. I spent the first day pulling records I hadn't looked at in detail, invoice files, bank statements by individual transaction rather than monthly summary, payroll disbursements, the supplier payment history against the original supplier agreements, which I had to dig out of a folder I hadn't opened in over a year. I sat at the desk in my apartment and I went through it all with the same methodical attention I used to give to client contracts back in Seattle, and I started to see it not all at once, but line by line, the way a pattern emerges when you stop looking at the picture from a distance and start looking at the individual brushstrokes. The inflated supplier invoices were the first thing I confirmed because I had the original contracts and the comparison was straightforward. 3 suppliers, consistent elevation of 10 to 15% across every invoice for the past 18 months. Not obvious to a casual review. Undeniable when you put the contract rate next to the invoice rate and do the math. The fake invoices took longer because they required me to contact the listed companies and confirm whether we had any actual business relationship. I spent an entire day making those calls. In every case, the answer was the same. The company existed, had no knowledge of our business, had issued no invoice to us. The cash withdrawals I found by going through the account statements line by line, transaction by transaction, which I had never done since handing account management to Cecilia. The petty cash disbursements were coded consistently, amounts mostly between $3,000 and $8,000, at a frequency of 2 to 3 times per month across 22 months. Individually, they looked like routine operational expenses. Together, they added up to something I had to tally 3 times because I didn't believe the first 2 results. By the end of the 4th day, I had a figure. The inflated supplier invoices accounted for roughly $90,000. The fake invoices, across 21 separate fabricated vendors, totaled approximately $115,000. The unauthorized cash withdrawals came to $240,000. Total misappropriated, $445,000, which I have been rounding to $445,000 because that is the approximate figure and precision feels almost beside the point. I called Ruth back. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Felix, call a lawyer in Manila today." I said I would. She said, "Call one you verified independently." I said I already had one I'd vetted at the start. She said, "Good. Call them first thing in the morning and don't do anything else before you do." I didn't call anyone that night. I sat in the apartment until late and I didn't call anyone because there was a part of me that needed some hours with the truth before I handed it to a process that would make it official and irreversible. I sat with it the way you sit with a diagnosis that you've been half expecting and half refusing to expect. Not with denial, I was past denial by the time the last transaction reconciled, with something heavier than denial, with the specific weight of understanding that the thing you built is not what you thought it was, and that the person you trusted to protect it was the one dismantling it, and that you missed it for 2 years not because you were stupid but because you were absent in the ways that made it possible. I called my attorney the next morning. His name was Adi. Ramos, I'll call him that, and he had handled the original company registration and had been available for occasional legal questions since then. He listened to my account with careful attention and then said he needed to see the documentation. I brought everything to his office that afternoon. He spent 2 hours with it and came back to me with a straightforward assessment. What I had documented was textbook estafa under Philippine law, misappropriation by an employee in a position of trust. The documentation I had assembled was strong. The case was prosecutable. He recommended filing a criminal complaint immediately and simultaneously securing the business premises and accounts before Cecilia had any indication that the investigation had begun. We moved on a Thursday morning. Addie, Ramos accompanied me to the business location. We arrived before opening. I had already instructed the bank the previous afternoon through Addie. Ramos's office, carefully and without alerting anyone at the business, to freeze the business accounts and remove Cecilia's signatory authority. When Cecilia arrived at 9:15 and I was standing in her office with a tea, Ramos beside me, and a printed summary of the transactions I had identified, the expression on her face told me something I needed to see. She didn't look shocked. She looked like a person calculating their next position. She said, "Mr. Felix, whatever you think you've found, let me explain." I said, "Cecilia, don't." She was quiet. I said, "I've been through every invoice, every disbursement, every supplier contract against every payment for the past 2 years. Addie, Ramos has reviewed everything. We're filing a criminal complaint today." She looked at Addie Ramos, not at me, and said, "There must be an accounting error." "Addie," Ramos said, "this is not an accounting error." She looked back at me and something shifted in her face. Not remorse, more like recalculation. She said, "The business needed those expenses, Felix. You were never here. You don't know what it costs to keep a business running when the owner is traveling." That sentence landed on me in a specific way. Not because it wounded me, I was past being wounded by her at that point, but because it revealed the structure of her justification. She had been waiting for years to say something like that. She had a story in which she was the overworked, underpaid manager holding everything together for an absentee owner, and the money she had taken was compensation for a contribution that had never been properly recognized. That story was self-serving and demonstrably false, and it also had just enough truth in the edges of it to sting. I had been absent. That part was true. "Cecilia," I said, "the invoice from a company that doesn't know our name, what expense does that cover?" She didn't answer. "The cash withdrawals coded as petty cash. 22 months of them. Where did that money go?" She looked at the window. "You can tell that to the authorities," I said. "You'll have time." We filed the complaint that afternoon. The accounts were frozen. I had my locksmith change the office locks, and I paid the 2 sales staff their wages through the end of the month and told them the business was undergoing a restructuring and I'd be in touch about their status. I called Marcus that evening, not because I needed anything specific from him, but because I needed to say it out loud to someone who knew me before any of this happened. Marcus is 38, works in project management, and has inherited his mother's pragmatism rather than my tendency to process things by going quiet. He asked me how much. I told him. He asked how long. I told him. He said, "Dad, you okay?" And I said I was, which was partly true. He said, "Do you need me to come?" I said no, not yet, that the legal process was in Addie Ramos's hands and that practically speaking there was nothing Marcus could do in Manila that I couldn't do myself. He said, "I'm asking if you need me to come, not whether it would be logistically useful." I thought about that and said, "Give me 2 weeks. Then yes, come." Pam called the following morning. Marcus had clearly called her, and her reaction was different from Marcus's. Where Marcus moved to practical questions, Pam's first response was empathy, the deep kind that comes from someone who has known you long enough to know what a thing like this actually costs you. She said, "Dad, you built that business. You loved that business." And she was right. That was the part I hadn't said to anyone yet, because it felt less important than the money and was actually more important than the money. I had loved that business. I had built it from nothing in a country I didn't grow up in. In a regulatory environment I had to teach myself, in a language I was still learning. I had found in that small operation in Mandaluyong a version of the thing I'd had in Seattle, the daily purpose, the problem solving, the sense of building something real, and Cecilia had been inside it for 2 years, taking it apart. Bob and Diane Forsyth came to see me in the 3rd week. Bob, who had brought me to the Philippines in the first place, who had been my original reference point for whether this life was possible. I had called him right after the discovery, partially because I owed him that conversation and partially because he had been in the Philippines long enough to have perspective I didn't have. He arrived with Diane, and a bottle of wine, he said, was for afterwards, and we sat in my apartment and I walked him through what I'd found. Bob listened without expression for most of it. At the end, he said, "The oversight gap. How long were you traveling each year?" I said probably 5 to 6 months total across the 2 years. He said, "And she had full account access for all of it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Felix, you handed a stranger the keys to the house and then went on vacation for half the year. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying that's not how you run a business in any country." I told him I knew that now. He said, "You knew it before, you just forgot it because she made it easy to forget." That was harder to hear than almost anything else anyone said to me in those weeks, because it was exactly right. Addie. Ramos was candid with me about the criminal proceedings timeline. The complaint had been filed. A preliminary investigation was underway, and if the prosecutor found sufficient basis to charge, the case would proceed to court, where Philippine criminal proceedings moved at a pace I needed to prepare myself for. He said financial recovery through criminal proceedings was possible, but uncertain and slow. He recommended a parallel civil action for the return of the misappropriated funds, which would run alongside the criminal case. He said I should expect a minimum of 2 years for meaningful resolution and should not make any decisions about the business premised on a specific recovery timeline. I spent several weeks deciding what to do with the business itself. The conclusion I reached, which took longer than it should have because I kept looking for a version of events where I could save what I'd built, was that the business wasn't salvageable in its current form. The supplier relationships that Cecilia had corrupted were going to require rebuilding from scratch. The staff trust had been disrupted. The accounts were frozen. The regulatory standing was fine. I had done nothing wrong, and Ramos had been clear that the business entity itself was not implicated in the fraud, but operationally there was nothing left to protect. I closed the business formally in the 4th month after the discovery, settled the remaining supplier obligations from personal funds, paid out the sales staff with 2 months' severance each, which I did not have to do and chose to do because they had done nothing wrong and their livelihoods had been disrupted by something entirely outside their control. Marcus came for 2 weeks in February. He is a practical man, but he is also a good man, and what he did during those 2 weeks was useful in 2 separate ways. He helped me organize the documentation for Addie, Ramos's case preparation, which his project management background made him well suited for timeline construction, evidence cataloging, correspondence filing, and he sat with me for long evenings on the balcony talking through what had happened and what came next in the way that only someone who has known you for decades can sit with something like this. He didn't moralize. He didn't say things about trust and betrayal that I would have found empty. He asked questions and he listened to the answers, and at the end of the 2nd week he said, "Are you going to stay?" I said I was thinking about it. He said, "Good. Don't let her take that from you too." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else said to me since January. Don't let her take that from you too. Because Cecilia had already taken the business, already taken the money, already taken 2 years of my confidence in my own judgment. The question of whether she was also going to take my relationship with the Philippines, the life I had built here, the mornings on the balcony, the food, the friendliness of ordinary daily life, the lightness that Bob had described to me in Seattle years ago and that I had found to be real when I arrived, that was a question only I could answer, and I kept coming back to the same place, which was that the answer no came from the wrong place. That the right place to make that decision from was not the wreckage of a fraud, but the actual facts of what this country and this life had been for me before Cecilia made it complicated. The actual facts were good, The Philippines had been good to me in every dimension except the one where I had been careless with my own safeguards. I stayed. Ernesto Cabral, my Filipino business partner who had been entirely nominal in the original company, called me after he heard about the closure through the business network he ran in. He expressed the kind of formal sympathy that Filipino business culture offers, which is more ritual than emotional, but which I appreciated as the gesture it was. He also said, quietly and without pressing, that if I ever wanted to try again different structure, different scale, different oversight arrangements, he would be open to a conversation. I told him I'd think about it. That conversation is still open. I haven't closed it. The criminal case against Cecilia reached the formal charging stage in month 7 of the process. Addy. Ramos considered the charge document solid and the evidence documentary rather than testimonial, which he said improved the prospects of conviction. He reiterated that even a conviction wouldn't guarantee full financial recovery because the question of where the money had actually gone was one that the investigation was still working through. Some of it, he suspected, had been moved through family accounts in ways that would take time to trace. Some of it was likely simply spent. The civil recovery action was proceeding on its own track, with an asset search that had turned up some items of value, a vehicle registered in Cecilia's name, a small land parcel in her province that could be subject to recovery orders. He said the likely recovery, even in the best scenario, was partial. I told him to pursue what was pursuable and to keep me informed. Ruth in Seattle has been more involved in my financial situation since all of this happened than she was before, which is the right arrangement. I send her quarterly reports now rather than annual ones, and she has a standing instruction to flag anything in the numbers that looks inconsistent rather than waiting for the annual filing process. It is the kind of oversight I should have been maintaining internally on the business, rather than delegating entirely to the person who had the most to gain from my inattention. Ruth has never said anything directly about how I managed the accounts before the fraud, but she asked me once, in her careful way, whether I wanted to talk through some improved monitoring practices going forward. I said yes. We spent an afternoon on it. I should have spent that afternoon 2 years earlier. Marcus and Pam are both doing what children do when a parent has a difficult year, which is to say they are calling more frequently and asking better questions and calibrating their worry against my actual state with the attentiveness of people who love someone and are trying to assess honestly whether that someone is okay. I tell them honestly when I am, and honestly when I'm less okay, which is a different pattern from the one I maintained for most of my adult life, where I defaulted to fine without examining it closely. That change is one of the few things from this whole experience that I'd identify as an unambiguous improvement. The business failure is the loss I feel most distinctly, more than the money, though both are real. I had been proud of what I built in Mandaluyong, not because it was large, it wasn't, by any significant standard, but because I had built it in a foreign country at 70 years old, from scratch, without the network and the infrastructure and the institutional knowledge I'd had in Seattle. It had worked. For 2 years before the fraud began, and for the period of the fraud itself, when I didn't know what was happening underneath the surface, it had worked. The model had been sound. The supplier relationships had been real. The customer base had been genuine. What Cecilia destroyed was not a flawed business that was failing anyway. She destroyed something that was working, which is in some ways the harder thing to accept. Bob and Diane have been steady through all of this in the way that friends of a certain kind are steady present without being intrusive, honest without being brutal. Bob said something to me about 3 months after the discovery that I've carried since. He said, "Felix, you know what you actually lost?" I said the business and the money, which I thought was the obvious answer. He said, "No, you lost about 18 months. That's the period between when you could have caught this and when you did catch it. The money is the price of those 18 months. The question is what you do with the months you have going forward. I'm still thinking about what I do with them. But the framing helped. There are specific moments from my time with Cecilia that I've revisited since January and that look different now than they did when they happened. There was a morning, about 14 months in, when I came back from a week away and found that the stockroom reorganization I'd specifically said I wanted to handle personally had been done in my absence. I was mildly irritated, and she said she'd thought it would save me time. I let it go because the reorganization was well done, and being annoyed about efficiency seemed petty. Looking back, I think she needed me out of the stockroom for unrelated reasons, and reorganizing it while I was away was a way of making my absence from it seem like her initiative rather than her requirement. There was a lunch, maybe 9 months in, where she mentioned in passing that her mother had been ill and had needed some medical expenses. I said I was sorry to hear that. She didn't ask me for anything. But a week later, when I looked at the petty cash disbursements for that period, there was an entry I hadn't questioned at the time that I now look at differently. I don't know for certain, but I look at it differently. There were small moments of what I interpreted as loyalty. Times she flagged a problem she could have hidden. Times she told me about a staff issue she could have resolved quietly without involving me. I think now that these moments were deliberate, that she understood that demonstrating selective transparency would reinforce my trust in a way that made the areas she wasn't transparent about harder for me to reach. She gave me enough honesty to make the dishonesty invisible. That is a sophisticated approach, and it worked for 2 years. What I know now that I didn't know when I hired Cecilia is not that employees can't be trusted. Most employees can be trusted most of the time. What I know is that trust and verification are not opposites. The version of trust I was practicing, a trust that rejected oversight as somehow insulting or unnecessary, was not mature trust. It was avoidance dressed up as faith. Real trust includes verification, not as a sign of distrust, but as the ongoing maintenance of an honest relationship between employer and employee. Cecilia knew I wasn't looking. She made that calculation early, and she was right for 2 years. The moment I looked, the calculation changed. I'm going to start something new. I've been in conversations with Ernesto about a different model, smaller scale, more focused product category, and a financial oversight structure that I will maintain personally and cannot be delegated regardless of how competent the person managing day-to-day operations is. Monthly transaction reviews against supplier contracts, quarterly third-party accounting audits, authorization thresholds that require my digital approval for any transaction above $2,000 regardless of who initiates it. The kind of structure I would have put in place without thinking twice in my Seattle business, where I knew the landscape, and that I neglected in Manila because the novelty of the environment made me rely on a single person's knowledge instead of building systems that didn't depend on any one person's integrity. I'm 71 years old. I've run one successful business for 34 years and one unsuccessful one for 2. The unsuccessful one was not unsuccessful because of the country or the market or the model. It was unsuccessful because I built it on a foundation of trust that I never supported with the systems that make trust sustainable. That's a lesson a man of my experience should have learned in Seattle and applied in Manila. Instead, I learned it in Manila the expensive way. $445,000. Cecilia Montoya. 2 years of running something good into the ground from the inside while I traveled and trusted and never once looked at the individual transaction records. I'm looking at them now. Going forward, I'll always look at them. The mornings here are still what they were before all of this. The light comes in differently than Seattle, earlier and sharper, and the city sounds different, and there is something about the temperature at 7 in the morning in Manila that I have never been able to describe accurately except to say that it is not unpleasant and that it is entirely its own thing. I sit with coffee and I look at the city and I think about the Mandaluyong shop and what it was before it was taken from me, and I think about what comes next, and the two things sit alongside each other without one canceling out the other. The shop is gone. What comes next is not. That's where I am. That's the full account of it. Not a story of a villain. Cecilia was a person who made choices that hurt someone who trusted her, and she will deal with those choices in a court and in whatever quiet reckoning people have with themselves when the calculating stops and the reality of what they did settles in. Not a story of a fool. I was a man who made a structural error that many reasonable people make, and I should have known better based on my experience. And knowing you should have known better is its own particular kind of tax. Just a story of a business and a trust and a 2-year absence that gave someone patient enough the window they were waiting for. Build the systems, check the numbers, and when somebody says you won't regret this, make sure you have the structure in place so that you don't have to take their word for it. Marcus left after 2 weeks and I drove him to the airport and we stood outside departures for a few minutes in that particular way. Fathers and sons stand when there is more to say than either of them knows how to start. He hugged me, which he doesn't always do, and he said, "Call me when you know what the next thing is." I told him I would. He said, "Not the business thing, Dad, the next thing for you. Where you want to be in a year?" I said I'd think about that. He said, "I know you will. I just want to hear you say it out loud when you figure it out." Then he went through the doors and I drove back to BGC and sat in the apartment and thought about what he'd asked. Where I want to be in a year. The honest answer, which took several weeks to clarify for me, is here. Still here, but differently. The life I'd built in Manila before the business consumed most of my attention was genuinely good. The mobility, the cost of living, the climate, the easy friendliness of daily interactions with people who have a particular quality of warmth that I noticed on my first visit and that has never stopped being real. Cecilia had not contaminated those things. She had taken the business. She had not taken the country. I started doing something in the weeks after Marcus left that I hadn't done since the early months of my first year in the Philippines. I started exploring again. Not in the tourist sense, I'd been past that phase for a while, but in the quieter sense of a man who has time and is choosing to use it deliberately. I went back to Cebu to visit Bob and Diane for a week and saw parts of the island I hadn't reached on my previous visits. I spent several days in Iloilo, which a Filipino colleague of Ernesto's had recommended with an enthusiasm that turned out to be entirely justified. I took a boat to one of the smaller islands in the Visayas and spent 4 days doing very little with great intentionality. None of these trips solved anything. They weren't meant to. They were me relearning how to be in the Philippines without the business organizing my time and attention, and what I found, gradually, was that the Philippines without the business was still a place I wanted to be. The business had been the center of my days for 2 years, and its loss had created a silence that felt at first like emptiness and then, slowly, like space. The civil recovery process surfaced something significant in its 3rd month. The asset search had found, through a combination of registry checks and investigative work that Addie Ramos had contracted to a specialist firm, that Cecilia had been using a portion of the misappropriated funds to purchase a condominium unit in Pasig in the name of a relative. The unit had been purchased 18 months prior, which placed it squarely in the middle of the fraud period. Addie Ramos filed an asset freeze order, and the matter went to a hearing on whether the property could be considered proceeds of the fraud and therefore subject to recovery. It was a significant development. The unit was valued at approximately $90,000, and while Ramos was careful about expectations, he said the documentary trail connecting the property purchase timeline to the fraud proceeds was strong. I found out about the property finding on a Tuesday afternoon and sat with it for a while before I felt anything other than a flat, abstract recognition that it was good legal news. What I felt eventually, once the abstract gave way to something more personal, was a kind of sad clarity. $90,000. That was what the unit was worth, against $445,000 taken. If the recovery went as well as possible in the civil action, I was looking at recovering perhaps a quarter of the total, best case, and that quarter would arrive years down the road after costs and proceedings and the particular grinding slowness of civil litigation. The rest was simply gone, absorbed into the ordinary, ongoing life of a woman who had spent 2 years being very careful about how she spent what wasn't hers. I told Ruth about the property finding. She received it in her characteristic way, which is to absorb new information and then ask what it changes about the plan going forward. I said it didn't change the fundamental picture. The business was closed. The money was largely unrecoverable. The criminal case was proceeding. The civil action had a partial asset to pursue. She said, "And your finances going forward?" I told her the honest answer, which was that I was down significantly from where I'd expected to be at this point, but not in a position of hardship. The business had been funded partly from my retirement reserves and partly from operational income, and the total of what I'd put into the business from personal funds before the fraud was about $120,000. The remainder of the $445,000 had been money the business had earned that Cecilia extracted before it could become profit. The net loss to my personal position was real and substantial, but not ruinous. Ruth said that was something. I said it was. The criminal case moved through its preliminary stages in the way that Philippine criminal proceedings move, which Addie Ramos had prepared me for accurately. There were delays. There were procedural requirements that generated their own procedural requirements. There were moments when I received an update from Addie Ramos that represented forward movement, and moments when I received updates that represented the normal friction of a legal system handling a significant volume of cases with the resources it has. I learned to receive both kinds of updates with the same level of equanimity, which took some practice, but which became possible once I accepted that the pace of the proceedings was entirely outside my control and that spending emotional energy on wanting them to move faster was energy spent for no return. What I have spent more productively is time on the question of what I actually learned and what I'm going to do with that learning. Not in a motivational sense. I'm past the age where I find motivational framings useful. In a practical sense. I ran a business for 34 years in Seattle, and I understood, in that context, the relationship between trust and verification. I knew that trusting an employee didn't mean not monitoring their work. I had systems. I had reconciliation processes. I had the cultural fluency in that industry and that city to calibrate when something was off. When I came to Manila and built something new, I abandoned all of that accumulated discipline because the environment was unfamiliar, and Cecilia was competent, and my own desire to travel and be free of daily operational responsibility was strong enough to override the caution I would have applied at home. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to understand how it happened. It wasn't naivety. It was the specific way in which wanting something strongly can cause a person to build the structure of their life around that want, rather than around the honest assessment of what that structure requires to be sound. I wanted the freedom of a business I could leave. I built that freedom without building the oversight mechanisms that would have made leaving safe. Cecilia found the gap between what I wanted and what I'd actually constructed, and she built her operation inside it. There's a business phrase I used in Seattle with people who came to me proposing arrangements that sounded attractive but had obvious structural vulnerabilities. If the plan only works while everything goes right, it's not a plan. I used that phrase enough times in my career that it became one of those embedded principles you stop consciously thinking about and just apply automatically. In Manila, I stopped applying it. I built a plan that only worked while Cecilia did what she said she was doing. When she stopped doing that, the plan had nothing. That's not a Philippine problem. That's a me problem. The country didn't take $445,000. A person took $445,000, and that person could have been sitting in that office manager chair in any city in any country in the world if the conditions I'd created had been replicated there. I want to be careful about that point because I think it matters. I've heard from other expats in the months since the fraud became known in my social circle, a quality of commentary that frames these situations as something about the Philippines, specifically about trust in developing economies, about the unique risks of doing business here, about what foreigners should expect when they invest in this part of the world. I disagree with that framing. I was robbed by one person who had specific motivations and specific skills and specific access that I provided. The Philippines has millions of honest employees, honest business partners, honest people who do what they say they're going to do, and more. Ernesto Cabral, my nominal business partner through the entire period of the fraud, was entirely honorable in an arrangement where a less honorable person could have caused all kinds of additional problems. Addie Ramos has been rigorous and trustworthy. Bob and Diane's decades of experience in this country have been defined by exactly the opposite of my recent experience. The country is not the lesson. The lesson is about oversight and systems and the specific error of building trust without building the infrastructure that makes trust sustainable over time. Pam called on a Tuesday in the month after Marcus's visit. She asked how I was doing, and I told her honestly better than I'd been in January, not yet where I was before January. She said, "Dad, what do you actually enjoy doing, right now, today?" I said, "I'd been writing." She said, "Writing what?" I said something like an account of what happened, starting from Seattle and going through all of it. She said, "Who is it for?" I said I wasn't entirely sure. Maybe myself. Maybe other people in similar situations who might benefit from the specific texture of how it unfolds from the inside. She said, "That sounds like something worth finishing." I said I thought it might be. She said, "Send it to me when you do." I said I would. I'm nearly there. Ernesto and I had coffee last week. The conversation about a new venture has become more specific in recent months, less exploratory and more practical. The proposed structure is different from the original company in ways that I designed specifically to address the vulnerabilities that the Cecilia situation exposed. Smaller operational footprint, no significant stock, no staff with account authority, a model that requires my direct involvement in all financial decisions rather than delegating them. It will limit the scale and therefore the upside, but the upside I'm interested in at 71 is not large-scale growth. It's the occupation, the daily engagement, the sense of building something in a place I've chosen. Those things are available at a scale that doesn't require me to hand over financial control to anyone. Ernesto seems genuinely interested in making the new arrangement work. I'm cautiously encouraged. Bob asked me last month whether I ever regretted coming to Manila. I thought about the question honestly, which is the only way I know how to take his questions. I said no. He asked me to be sure about that before I answered. I said I was sure. The Philippines, the life here, what I found when I arrived and what has survived the fraud in the closed business and the painful year that followed, none of it was a mistake. The mistake was inside a set of choices I made about how to run the thing I built here, not about coming here to build it. Bob said, "I know. I just wanted to hear you say it." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because men in your position sometimes spend the rest of their time being angry at the wrong thing, and I didn't want that to be you. It's not going to be me. I've spent enough time in the past 18 months being angry at the right things, the fraud, the specific betrayal of a specific trust. The 2 years of oversight I failed to provide that I have a reasonable accounting of what the anger is for and where it should be aimed. It isn't aimed at Manila. It isn't aimed at the Philippines. It isn't aimed at the general proposition that a man of my age in a foreign country can build something worthwhile and do it in a way that doesn't destroy him. All of those things remain true. I have coffee in the mornings, and I write, and I take walks in the evening when the heat has eased, and I talk to Marcus and Pam on weekends, and I have lunch with Bob every couple of weeks, and I meet with Addie Ramos monthly for case updates, and I'm slowly, carefully, building the outlines of what comes next. It's a smaller life than the one I arrived here planning to have. It's more honest than that version would have been. I'll take that. 71 years old, retired businessman from Seattle, down $445,000, rebuilding what can be rebuilt, holding on to what was never Cecilia's to take, moving forward with better systems and the same basic faith in the proposition that brought me here, that a man of this age, in a country not his own, can still build something worth having. The mornings say yes to that. I'm going to keep listening.